Hello everybody and welcome to our last week of the section. Well, of the semester too. In today's class we're going to be finishing up this concept of socio-emotional growth by discussing the very last topic that we're going to be discussing, and that's moral development. In particular, how our perceptions on morality and our understanding of what is moral and is not moral actually change with age. Now, this particular class is going to be a little different from the rest of them in the sense that when we look at this topic, what we're going to see are some ideas and generalizations about how morality might change and how we might become either more moral or change our perspective of morality as we age. But we're going to also acknowledge in this class that we don't really know whether or not morality growth fits a specific pattern, whether or not we actually grow in morality the same way we grow in cognitive development or emotional development like we've talked about in previous classes. The other reason why this class is a bit unique is it's not going to really follow perfectly from the text. Not that all of them follow perfectly from the text, but in this one we're going to deviate a lot from the text because even though we're going to address morality like the text does, we're going to kind of skip the last section of the text that looks at religion and how we grow in religion. And that's partially because this particular part of the chapter isn't one that's very based in science, and it seemed to be more of one that was based in opinion by the author. And even though I have no objections to religion, I have no problems with religion, I don't want you to feel as though religion is the only solution to growing in morality, and that seems to be one of the interesting implications that you get from the text. And there isn't substantial research really to support a lot of the findings and a lot of the arguments that were made in the end of this class. So we're going to kind of just leave that and end this class a little bit earlier today than usual by just focusing in on half of the section that we were going to be covering this week. So on with this concept of moral development. And when we look at moral development, one of the first things we actually need to do, as is the case in most classes, is define the topic that we're looking at. In particular, we need to define the concept of morality. Well, when we're talking about morality from the standpoint of psychologists, what we're looking at is some overall sense of the difference between right and wrong. Now, morality very often is tied in with religion. Morality is sometimes tied in with spirituality. And sometimes morality is just kind of tied into evolutionary psychology and the benefits to it. We don't really argue in this class and in developmental psychology where morality is inherently coming from, whether or not it's natural or whether or not it's something that just kind of springs up through learned experiences. But what we do acknowledge in this class is that as we age, our sense of morality and our sense of right and wrong does develop. It does change. And there's a number of aspects to that sense of morality that does change. One of the things that changes is our standards of morality. So what constitutes moral behavior, what constitutes immoral behavior actually changes as we grow, and we're going to look at the developmental process and how those standards change in this class. Another big thing that we alter as we grow up is our beliefs in the outcomes for moral behaviors and for morality in general. So some people might believe that there's an inherent punishment to things, but when we look at people's behaviors, when we look at people's interpretations of kind of immediate punishment to behaviors, what we can see in the developmental phases is that people's perspectives on whether or not we're going to be punished for our particular actions does change as we age. And we can also, as we look at people that age, that people typically recognize that there's much more complexity in morality as they get older, and their moral related behaviors, so how they act in attempts to be moral, also tend to change with age. And when we look at this concept of morality from a developmental perspective, what we can get is a very clean understanding that a large portion of moral development has to emerge over our lifetime. It's not something that we're born with or something that we display at a very, very young age. The first researcher to look at this concept of morality and recognize that there was actual change in morality was somebody that we've already discussed in this class when we talked about cognitive development, and that was Jean Piaget. Now, in Piaget's work, in addition to showing that kids kind of change their schemas of how the world work and process things differently, Piaget also found during his studies that people also, at least young children, also grow in their understanding of morality. And he argued that this transition in morality for young children happened somewhere between the ages of 4 to 7, usually a little bit after 6 and a little bit before the age of 7, or even right after the age of 7. And what Piaget argued was that before the age of 7, children have a very simplified version of morality. First off, they believe that everything is either right or wrong. So you're doing something because you're moral or immoral, and there's no in-between. There's no gray area for young children. And this kind of relates to another concept that they adopt. It's something called heteronymous morality. Try saying that 10 times. When they look at heteronymous morality, what this means is the belief that not only is there an inherent sense of right or wrong for behaviors, but that right or wrong can't be changed. That even if something weird happens, then you can't really change the rules. You can't change whether or not something is right or wrong. And Piaget gave a very great example of this in his research when he showed that young children before about the age of 6 or 7 can't handle changes to the rules in games. So if you're playing a game that you invent with a child and you find something that might make it more entertaining or more interesting and you try to change it in the middle, what you'll often encounter is that child getting very upset with you because they believe, even if it's to their advantage, that you must be cheating by changing this around. And that's based on this sense of heteronymous morality that children have. Another thing that children believe before the age of 7 is that when we look at these immoral behaviors, when we look at things that people do wrong, these wrong behaviors will always be met with punishment. They argue that this is something called imminent justice, that if you behave immorally, even if nobody's around so nobody sees you, eventually you'll be punished. Eventually something bad will happen to you. And not only do they believe that you'll be punished for doing something wrong, but if you're doing something immoral, even if you don't know it's immoral, it's just as bad. So if a child accidentally cheats at a game or accidentally does something wrong, even though that person might be able to recognize that the other individual doesn't know the difference between right or wrong or doesn't pick up on it, it doesn't mean that that child's going to assume that that behavior is any less moral. And when we look at kind of this perspective, we can see a very clean-cut, easy interpretation of how the world should work. But as children get older, as they get exposed to what Piaget would call new schemas, new interpretations of the world, so they might not get caught for doing something wrong, or they might see somebody else not getting caught, or they might be exposed to people trying to change the rules a lot. And eventually what will happen is children will transition to a new level of morality, a new concept of morality that reinterprets the difference between right and wrong. In particular, when children get beyond the age of 7, what they develop is a much more social-based perspective on morality. So instead of looking at things as right or wrong and just rules, instead they look at things as more of a negotiated standard. So when we look at kind of this new perspective of morality, instead of having this inherent justice and this automatic rule, children now develop something called autonomous morality. The belief that when we look at rules of games or laws or anything else, these rules, even though they probably are something we should still follow, are sometimes flawed and all the time generated by individuals. They're agreed upon. So you can change the rules in games, you can change the rules in school, and by changing them you can kind of alter what's right and what's wrong. And when we look at that kind of change to autonomous morality, we can see really a growth in the understanding of the complexity of rules and kind of a new appreciation of this question of whether or not somebody's behavior is actually right or wrong. We also see, though, in growth in these children is the notion that instead of always being caught for something, punishment is now, in the children's perspective, only handed out when an individual is actually caught for a specific behavior. Now, religion sometimes impacts the belief of kind of the limit of fallible justice, but the concept of fallible justice is based on the notion that in this world, in this reality, you're only going to be punished if somebody else notices your specific behavior. The last big development that children go through in this particular age bracket is that they not only develop kind of this sense of kind of gray zones, but they also start to recognize that immorality is really based on intentionality, on the desire of what a person's actually doing. So if you're not aware that your behavior is immoral, it's perceived as less immoral than somebody who knows they're doing something wrong. And if you do something that's immoral without intending to do it, then that's not nearly as immoral. So if you push somebody in front of a car, that's obviously something that's considered extremely immoral. But if you accidentally bump into somebody that gets hit by a car, well, that's not nearly as immoral. And this is a differentiation that children can make once they get beyond this age of about 6 or 7 years. And that growth in understanding continues into adulthood until we really have these concepts of autonomous morality, fallible justice, and intentionality really ingrained into our sense of morality. And by having those things, what we can start to do is judge gradients of morality instead of whether or not somebody's right or wrong. And we can easily recognize this just by presenting people with very specific, concrete situations. An example of this could be something like the story that you see listed below about Gary and Kenny. And in Gary and Kenny's situation, which I'd like you to read in a few seconds, what we should be able to do as we grow in our morality is be able to recognize kind of the range of morality in people's behaviors and recognize the subtle nuances that might alter our perspectives of morality, and in this case, might not alter our perspectives of morality. So what I'd like you to do is read this story about Gary and Kenny, and then rate on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being very immoral and 10 being extremely moral, how moral both Gary and Kenny individually are in this particular action. Now, as you're finishing up reading this, thinking about the numbers, I'm guessing that you probably scored Gary and Kenny fairly low on their morality, even though they had some extenuating circumstances. So, I'm partially assuming that you didn't give Gary and Kenny a 1, even though some of you might, but I know that most of your scores, or at least I'm assuming most of your scores, were somewhere in like the 2 to 5 range. Well, that's fairly low, but it's also, as we see, fairly consistent between Gary and Kenny, and that's partially because of the fact that we've started to recognize that imminent justice isn't there. That even though Gary didn't get caught, that doesn't mean Gary is any less immoral than Kenny in this particular situation. It's just Kenny can't obviously run as fast. And that differentiation, that ability to pick up on those differences, is a great example of how you've grown in your understanding of morality over the years. But there's other ways that we can grow as well. Looking back at that last exercise, I'd like you now to kind of redo this particular performance with 2 other individuals, Becky and Erica. So first read the story about Becky. Rate her on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being still extremely immoral and 10 being extremely moral. And Erica with those same scales, and we'll see what you came up with. So what you can probably see from these two stories are very good examples of kind of mixed immorality. Situations where people might have had the intention of behaving immorally, but kind of prevented themselves from behaving immorally in the long run, and some who didn't have the original intention of behaving immorally, but kind of ran into a situation that really enticed them to do that. The question is, who's being more immoral? Now, I'm guessing you thought both individuals were fairly immoral, but I'm also guessing that some of you probably thought Erica, even though she didn't get to cheat, was probably more immoral than Becky in the long run. And that kind of recognition of differentiation is another great example of your really seeing the gray zones, seeing these differences and the subtle nuances. And when we look at theories of moral growth, the ideas that we progress, what we can see in your descriptions, also in your justification for your descriptions, is a gradual increase in your development of morality. And what we usually assume, even though this might not be the case for everybody, is that you're becoming more moral as you age, not less moral. You're becoming more dynamic in your understanding of morality as you age. Well, this idea of growth in morality, this kind of continual transition to becoming a much more moral individual, is something that another researcher after Piaget actually picked up. It was one of Piaget's students, but instead of just looking at morality as that moment of transition, he saw morality as something that was a continually growing process, just like the stages of cognitive development that we talked about earlier. This individual, the one that looked at morality in stages instead of just one instance, was a man named Lawrence Kohlberg. Kohlberg was a student of Piaget's. In fact, he got most of his ideas of development and this concept of morality from Piaget's early work. But instead of looking at just cognitive development, Kohlberg was obsessed with looking at how we grow morally, because he was convinced that we didn't just have one breakthrough, that we had constant breakthroughs throughout our life, and we were actually going through different stages of moral development, and that we could test these stages in a very, very simple way. What he would do in his tests is present people with stories like the story you see above, the story of Heinz. In this particular story, it mentions a man whose wife is gravely ill, and the doctor who invented a drug that theoretically can save him. But because of a conflict, because of the doctor being somewhat greedy, the man isn't able to actually acquire this drug. And the question is whether or not the man should steal the drug, and if so, whether or not his behavior is moral or immoral. And it asks you to kind of not only say whether or not the man should have stolen the drug, whether the man should have done what he did, but also why he should have done that. And what Kohlberg believed is not only that your answer mean something, so yes or no does have some impact on our understanding of morality, but more importantly, how you justify it, how you justify the behavior that you're reading about. Essentially, he thought that this gave us information about your level of morality, which was well beyond just saying whether or not the behavior should have or shouldn't have been committed. So when we look at Heinz, if you said yes, and you explain why, that why can be used to figure out your stage of moral development. In Kohlberg's studies, when he measured the responses of individuals, what he was able to do was differentiate people into one of three different levels: pre-conventional, conventional, and post-conventional levels of morality. But within each of those three different levels, he argued that there were two different stages that were slightly different from each other and kind of progressed naturally from one to the next. So at the first level, the pre-conventional level of responses, we had both stage 1 and stage 2. Responses relating to stage 1, or heteronymous morality stages, involve this idea that when we look at morality, when we look at behavior, just like we talked about earlier with Piaget, there's this notion that children obey rules based on this notion that there's a right or wrong, and there's no way to change them. And that if you do something wrong, no matter what your justification, it's wrong. Well, when we moved past stage 1 into stage 2, what we start to do is think about things as being related to our own interests. So, not only what's right and wrong, but what benefits us versus hurting us. And a lot of times we transition into thinking of morality as kind of what the rules are to what's good for us. And that transition from stage 1 to stage 2 keeps us in the pre-conventional stage, but it prepares us for the next stage of development that we're theoretically going to go into, and that's stage 3, or the second level of development, the conventional level, where instead of looking at just ourselves and the rules and the laws, we start to focus on the social world. So we talk about relationships, whether or not this behavior is going to help or hurt relationships, and we judge morality based on kind of how the behavior impacts the relationship. Then we talk, and when we get into stage 4, about systems. So not only individual relationships, but overarching ideas. So it's against the law, so you shouldn't do it because we need to maintain the law. Or it's somebody's duty as a husband to find food or drugs or whatever for their wife. If that was the justification you were giving, and you were giving it in multiple stories, like the story of Heinz that you read, the idea would be that you're at stage 4 of moral development. But there's 2 more stages that some people get into as they progress throughout their life. And these 2 stages are found within that 3rd level, the post-conventional level of moral development. Stage 5, which relates to kind of this social idea, an overarching idea, transitions people into not only thinking of kind of right and wrong, the idea of laws and justifications of how things work, but also kind of overarching principles of how the world works. So the point of laws, the point of society, and all of these different things. And when we talk about these overarching ideas, these social contracts and rights and human beings, and kind of remove ourselves from the social world and kind of intertwine the individual with the social, what we're doing is giving answers that relate to stage 5. And when we finally move to the last idea, this idea that goes beyond the individual and kind of the inherent good of humankind and the overall nature of human rights, we're giving answers that are based in stage 6. And the idea of Kohlberg, when he did this research, is that when we look at the responses of people, what we should see is that there's a tendency for them to consistently respond at one stage or one level of morality. And as we age, what we should probably do is transition from the first to the second, second to the third, third to fourth, fourth to fifth, and fifth to sixth, until we reach adulthood. And there is some considerable evidence to show that this transition sort of takes place. A number of Kohlberg's early studies show that most children at the age of about 13, or even a little younger than that, the age of 10, perform at about a level 1 or stage 1 of morality. But when they ask these same children 3 years later, most of their responses tend to focus around stage 3. And if you ask these same children another 3 years later, we see responses that relate to stage 5. And we don't see this in everybody, and Kohlberg never implied that all of us reach stage 5 or 6 in adulthood, but we do see typical growth in most individuals, a natural progression from stage 1 to stage 6, at least in our Western culture. When we look at where this change is coming from, both Kohlberg and Piaget kind of agreed with each other in the sense that most of our growth in morality and our ideas of what's right and wrong are coming from our social world. Right? We need to be exposed to morality, and we also need to be exposed to logic that relates to morality. So we almost have this idea of scaffolding that we talked about with Vygotsky playing a critical role in our understanding of morality and how we can actually think about things. And not only do we have to experience other people's thinkings, but a lot of people believe, and Piaget and Kohlberg were 2 of them, that we have to experience those exceptions to law, those kind of counterintuitive experiences that we all have to undergo in order to really truly grasp this idea of morality and all the ambiguous things that often go with it. With that being said, even though we have very clear-cut evidence that most of the people in the United States do seem to go through very clear-cut growth, and that a lot of this growth is socially derived, what we've seen in subsequent studies is that even though Kohlberg's studies were very interesting and very powerful, there also seems to be a lot of flaws with them. One of the major flaws that we run into is the fact that this growth in morality, this kind of change in transitional thought, doesn't always seem to be universal across different cultures. Now, there is a consistency from most cultures with how we grow morally, but there's also some cultures where we skip a lot of this social role thing and focus more on the inherent good of the group, of the big society as a whole. And there's also some cultures that believe that the social roles, fulfilling your role as a husband or a wife or a father or a daughter or anything like that, is the penultimate level of morality. That if you look at people as a whole and judge all these different interactions and kind of incorporate yourself and society into things, then you're not being as moral as you could if you just focus on your roles. And those differentiations between cultures, the different expectations of what's truly the most moral behavior, tells us that some aspects of morality are socially derived, that they're a product more of our culture than they are the natural growth within the individual. Another major problem that we have with this concept of morality is when we study it from the cognitive perspective and kind of look at this idea of cognitions, what we can also see is that a lot of times this growth in morality might just be linked to cognitive growth, in particular attentional changes. So in the pre-conventional level, what it seems like most of our explanations are based on is this recognition of the self, this kind of focus on the world revolving around us and everything dealing with us. When we get to the conventional level, it seems like people are just focusing on this new social role, this interaction that they're involved with. And when we get to the post-conventional level, it seems like children are finally able to kind of incorporate both themselves and the world around them in their explanations. Now, this might not be true, but it definitely brings some more skepticism to the table when we look at whether or not Kohlberg's theories were as absolute as he had originally believed. One other major problem that we saw, or at least that was proposed when Kohlberg presented his ideas, is the notion that when we look at morality, not only might it not be consistent across cultures, but it also might not be consistent across genders. In fact, there was a researcher named Carol Gilligan who set out for a number of years to prove that females and males were different in their level of morality, not only in their type of morality, but in their overall ability to behave morally. Well, Gilligan spent a number of years proving that this was the case, and a number of researchers have consequently spent a number of years disproving Carol Gilligan's theories. In fact, since Gilligan's earlier ideas, nobody's really been able to replicate her findings that indicated that there was a difference between the genders in morality. So, guy or girl, young or old, we all have our expectations of morality, but we seem to all be kind of just transitioning between levels. That's partially due to our experience and our culture, but possibly also due to our cognitive growth. One final interesting tidbit when we look at moral development, and something that Kohlberg never had thought of when he was proposing it, at least never mentioned when he was proposing it, is the fact that when we look at the test that Kohlberg derived, when we look at the test that you guys did earlier in class, one of the problems we often run into is the fact that people's descriptions of morality and people's actions of morality are very, very different from each other. So when somebody's enticed to cheat in reality, even if they think that cheating is abhorrent and the worst thing in the world, more often than not, we have a tendency to cheat. And when we talk about kind of the story of Heinz and this idea of stealing medicine, what most of the time happens is people say that Heinz should have broken in, should have stolen the medicine. When people are encountering those similar situations, there isn't that consistency in their behavior. Very few people would actually break into the store, and most of their justifications are more indicative of lower levels of moral reasoning. So there is very often a mismatch between what we do and what we say we're going to do that brings further question into this concept of whether or not we're developing morally. That being said, when we look at where morality is coming from, and this idea that we're still becoming more complex, there is a belief by most cognitive psychologists and social psychologists that somewhere along the way, as we grow, we are becoming much more capable of handling other ideas of morality and seeing subtle nuances to this concept of morality. And what we see within growth of individuals is that there are specific areas of moral understanding that seem to emerge as we get older and as we encounter enough social situations. One of the things that we start to see is that morality starts to be perceived as something that involves more of a range. So instead of just defining something as good or bad, what we start to do is focus on whether or not somebody's behavior is kind of harming others or helping others. And instead of saying that somebody's behavior is moral because of the law or anything else like that, we seem to focus more on whether or not somebody's behaviors are helping or harming. We also, as we grow, tend to start to become what's called morally conditioned. In essence, we start to behave more morally, or at least behaviors that are related to morality, because of the fact that we've been punished for behaviors that are considered immoral and rewarded for behaviors that are considered moral. And that causes us, most of the time, even if we're not thinking about it, to be more moral as we get older. We also have a tendency as we grow to not only grow in our tendency to be more moral and our tendency to be more pro-social and recognize the differences between them, but we also tend to learn a couple areas of interest, or I guess identify a couple areas of interest with respect to morality. One of the things we do is we learn who we are morally. So we get a sense of whether or not we're an extremely moral individual or a very immoral individual, and we can articulate why that's the case as we age. And we're continually growing this sense of identity throughout our entire lifetime. And we also are picking up on exemplars all the time. So we see people that epitomize our concept of morality. Something like Robin Hood, as you see in the picture to the right, might be a figure that we're exposed to as we age, and we start to kind of draw from those individuals, and we use them to determine what's right and wrong, what's moral and what's not. And if we can assign a behavior to somebody that epitomizes either something that's very moral or immoral, we can get a better sense of whether or not that behavior itself is immoral or amoral. And that kind of growth, that recognition that we typically run into, is another part of the cognitive growth, social growth process of morality. What we also start to develop as we get older, and one last big thing that we pick up on, is something called situation-specific morality. In essence, the recognition that we might be moral in one situation for doing something, but it might be extremely immoral in another situation to do that exact same behavior. And that behavior relates to something that we call competencies. Behaviors that we do that we consider moral. And what we see very often is that these competencies that we grow become situation specific, that we recognize the cues around us and determine exactly what's moral in that situation. But if we don't have those same cues around us in a later time, in a different situation, we pick up on the fact that those behaviors might not be considered moral at that point. And that growth in situation-specific morality is one of the final major things that we're kind of growing on and becoming more adept at as we age and as we progress throughout our lives. One of the things that we've yet to really pick up on, though, is where this growth in morality is coming. So we've argued that we have all these growths in moral thought, moral learning. We also have stages that we might progress through, and we also talked about the fact that a lot of this might be learned. But what we haven't stressed is where we're actually learning it. Well, Kohlberg and Piaget were very adamant that most of our moral growth came from our peers, from our friends and the people we were exposed to at school. But subsequent research has shown that other avenues have also typically helped us in our moral development. One of the classic areas that seems to help is in our parents and their behavior. And there's 4 major reasons why parents can typically help us in our moral growth. One of the ways our parents can help us is in modeling. So instead of just telling a child to behave morally, if a parent actually acts morally, if a parent does something that's considered moral and they're very proud of it, a child typically can model after the parents, and they can mimic those behaviors and try to behave in a similar way. If a child sees a parent that's not behaving very morally, even if a parent tells them not to do it, one of the classic statements, "do as I say, not as I do," is something that's very difficult for children to do, because if their parents are doing it, they feel as though they should do it, and that causes a lot of times parents or children to follow in the steps of parents. We also see that parents can affect children through 3 other mechanisms: empowering, cocooning, and pre-arming. Empowering involves parents teaching children and responses, behaviors that they can do when they encounter moral situations or moral problems. Cocooning involves protecting children from kind of temptation in situations where they might be more apt to act immorally, because even though most of us might want our children to experience a lot of things, a number of studies have shown that when kids are exposed, especially to a large extent, a number of temptations and a number of situations that they shouldn't be in, when they're not ready for these things, it's very tough for them to resist them, and they might start to kind of associate immoral behaviors as being acceptable or being common nature. So cocooning too much might be a problem, because it kind of prevents a child from seeing anything that might cause them to backlash. But cocooning to an extent has been proven in a number of studies to be somewhat helpful to children. And pre-arming, so not only making kids kind of aware of what's going on, but kind of giving them the correct responses or giving the correct behaviors, is another big thing that parents can do. So we empower by kind of giving them the confidence, giving them the tools to feel like they can that they can be immoral. We cocoon to protect kids from too much temptation and too many problems, and we pre-arm by giving kids kind of a script or a behavior that they can do when they do encounter these problems. And by doing this as parents, we can increase morality levels of children and the moral growth of children in a very rapid pace at a very young age. Schools also have been linked to growth and morality, in particular by helping kids set standards, by kind of clearly stating what's cheating and what's not, and what's acceptable and what's not, and also not only creating standards but creating identities for children. So by allowing kids to do things like service learning, like you see in the picture above, or by allowing them to kind of stipulate their values, or what they believe is good and what they believe is bad, in classrooms and outside of the classroom with respect to the schools, what we can do is set kids up to kind of form a perception of themselves that encourages them to be more moral as they age. If we believe we're moral, if we see ourselves as that, we're going to behave in kind. And very often, one of the problems we run into with schools is the fact that they're not promoting this as much anymore. They're not encouraging kids and teaching kids not only how to be moral, but that they are moral individuals, and that they just have to act in a specific way to maintain that level of morality. And when we combine peers, parents, and school, there's a strong belief by most moral researchers studying morality, that we can definitely improve levels of morality and moral behavior of individuals. A couple other sources of morality that we've linked over the years aren't 100% found to be effective are things like religion, internal thoughts, and personal experience. In particular, with personal experience, we're talking about past encounters and encounters to pro-social or antisocial behavior, either on television or in our community. Internal thoughts deal with kind of the thinking patterns that a child goes through. And these are kind of tough for us to really control, but the idea is that as a child plays with things, thinks about things, they might grow in their morality abilities. And the last thing that seems to have a big impact on morality is religion. Now, religion could be very good just in its inherent sense, but it also can be good in the sense that it creates a bond. It creates kind of the sense of responsibility to another group of individuals. And a number of studies have shown that not only religious groups, but things like sports teams or community helping groups also seem to really trigger growth and morality within young children. It obviously doesn't mean that religious groups are bad. In fact, most of them are very, very good at creating more moral individuals and people that are more socially adept. But the book and other sources sometimes go a little bit beyond what they find and make the assumption that they're the only route to becoming more moral. And I personally and a lot of researchers take a little bit of exception to that. Religion, it might be very good, and it seems to be very good in a number of situations, but it's probably not the only way to instill moral growth within individuals.
Well, that marks actually the end of the class for the semester. I really appreciate all of your submissions, your conversations. The participation was very good for a number of you this semester. If you have any questions between now and that exam, make sure that you contact me. I don't want to leave anything open about grades or anything else, but for everything else, you are all but finished. So please, enjoy your studies, enjoy your last week, and maybe I'll see you guys in the future.